Very much, Chair. I know he's a hard act to follow, so and in deference to the hour, I'll try and curtail my remarks somewhat. But I do have to say, Minister, that it gives me no pleasure to say that really not only do I think that the legislation before us is not going to make things better for the families and the individuals who are in absolutely dire straits tonight in terms of the crisis in the private rental market, but also those who've been made homeless. But I actually genuinely believe that what we're looking at here is going to make the situation worse. And the reason for that is that in reality, this bill is really just a depressing continuation of the types of housing policies that successive governments have been pursuing for years now. I think other deputies have dealt very well with the whole aspect of rent predictability, which is wholly inadequate in terms of the provisions of the legislation. And while it's obviously encouraging to see aspirations outlined in terms of the rental strategy, in terms of regulating standards and in indefinite tenure and so on, a lot of this has been left to let's wait and see what happens. Now, the problem here and the root of this is that housing policy in Ireland over the last 30 years has basically boiled down to giving the developers whatever they ask for in the hope that they'll deign to build a few houses to therefore supposedly magically increase supply. To hell with the unregulated development, and to hell with the fact that historically there's no link or very little link in Ireland between increasing supply and throwing carrots at developers and lower housing costs. The figures dispute your whole premise that's before us. The figures are there. Between 1991 and 2006, for example, 762,541 housing units were built in Ireland. At the same time, house prices increased between 300 and 400% in different parts of the country. More supply doesn't mean more affordable housing stock. And more affordable housing stock is what is desperately required by Irish citizens. And everything that's been done proves that point. I mean, from at least the 1986 Urban Renewal Act, the state has thrown billions in incentives to the private property market, from hotels, nursing homes, student accommodation. The Section 23 tax relief cost the state well over $1 billion, and despite all of these reliefs and incentives, we still have a dysfunctioning housing market and periodic crises, and that's because there is no link between incentivising developers into the rental market and lower rents. And the proof of that is the fact that the Section 23 rent relief, the highest outlay on that was in 06 and 07, 2 years in which there were the peak levels of rents. And I suppose the whole problem with the bill really is that it's continuing to further the vested interests who have not come forward with a solution to our housing problem. Now, I just want to deal very briefly with the three amendments from us that are in this section of the bill. Amendment number 56 is about repeal of Section 19(2)(b), and that's really there in the event, unlikely although it might be, that our rent control amendment number 58 is accepted. It probably won't be, and in that instance we won't be pressing amendment number 56. But amendment number 57, I really don't see now why you wouldn't take this on board. That is simply dealing with the issue of defining market rent. Now, I raised this issue last year in the debate on the Residential Tenancies Amendment number 2 Bill 2012. We didn't have a proper definition of market rent a year ago, and we still don't have one now. The legislation as it stands, Section 19 of the Residential Tenancies Act, basically talks about market rent, but it really defines it incredibly loosely, and that's a huge part of the problem. It really is akin to something sort of charging the prices whatever somebody wants to charge for it. It's incredibly vague. Whether a landlord is charging the market rent for a property is left to the RTB to decide after the event. Absolutely ludicrous. And the proof, if you like, of the uselessness of the definition, the current definition, if you could even call it that, is that it's nothing. It has done nothing to stop rents from increasing over 40% over the last number of years. Now, the '04 definition talks about market rent being dwellings of a similar size, type and character and situated in a comparable area. But none of these aspects of it are actually defined. So let's look at size first, because size does actually matter. And if you look at Daft and all the rest of it, you won't see any size defined in terms of square feet or square meterage in any rental property at all. Nobody collects data on price per square metre of rental properties in Ireland. Nobody is under any obligation to state the size of the property. Instead, what we have is this number of bedrooms acting as a sort of a proxy for size, completely erroneously, because in Ireland a two-bedroom can be anything from 40 to 100 square metres. A two-bedroom can really be a one-bedroom with a bit of plywood thrown up, pretending to masquerade as a one-bed, pretended to be a two-bed, because there's no real regulation, there's no enforcement of standards in rental properties, and sizes can vary massively. Now, we do need data if we're going to regulate the rented sector properly and to set prices, and that is critically important. And I don't for the life of me see why we haven't adopted models of other jurisdictions like the Mietspiegel arrangement, the rental mirror system which operates in Germany, an index of local rents per square metre prepared by local government that serves as a guideline for market rents. It's an official document. It must be referred to in the setting and increasing of rent, and it contains information on the age of every property in every city, in every town, its size, the price range from high to low per square metre of properties in a similar size, and so on. And it's so granular there that it'll actually give you the average price of 20 properties in the same street. Why can't we do something like that? It's not actually that difficult. And collecting data is very important. And it is an important first step towards regulating renting in Ireland for a better system for landlords and for tenants. I'm glad that the government is talking about some of these issues, but it's not enough, and it's not done in a defined enough way. I mean, for example, what's a comparable area? You know, is Sandymount comparable to Clontarf? Is it Ranelagh, Fairview? Who knows who defines these things? But what is clear is that the looser you leave it, then the more open it is to exploitation and so on, which is regrettable. That's our Amendment 57 to define market rent, and I really don't see why you wouldn't agree to that definition as it stands in our amendment. Our other amendment in this section is number 58, which is again calling for the issue of rent control, and I'm not going to at this hour repeat the points raised by other deputies about the 4%, which I think have been very well made, but you know, the measures being put forward by the government are not going to help, and I think they're actually going to make things worse. The only way to control cost is to control rent, and that means proper rent control, not just within tenancies, but at the beginning of tenancies too. And I mean, let's face it, this might have been a radical proposal 4 years ago. It's not radical now, it's actually a very basic ABC that something has to be done now to stop rents going up further. And our proposal to link that to the CPI is the only sane way of doing that. Anything else is just window dressing, which will make the situation worse. And the last point I want to touch on in this section, Count Corla, is really what's been missing from a lot of the discussion about the private rental market in Ireland is the buy-to-let mortgages and the significance of those mortgages for our troubled banks. If you look at the figures, last month there were 173,956 tenancies registered with the RTB. 2 months before that, the central bank reported that there were 132,571 buy-to-let mortgages on their books with a value of 24.6 billion. Now, in our policy and discussions and strategy about regulating rent, we've heard an awful lot about accidental landlords and the government's fear of the need in bringing forward measures that we don't inadvertently penalise these poor people who bought houses during the boom, who were maybe family size, required them to move out, who weren't able to sell the property and became reluctant landlords. I know many of these people. They undoubtedly do exist. But if you look at the figures that I've just quoted to you there, it shows that we can work out that that is not the majority of tenancies. 76% of the tenancies in Ireland are overseen by landlords for whom the property was an optional investment. So when we talk about being worried about the accidental landlords, we're actually using that argument to hide the fact that what you're really worried about protecting is the investment properties, and not just them, but the impact of those on the bank's mortgage balance sheets. That's really why rents are being let skyrocket, so that tenants can pay off the buy-to-let mortgage arrears from a period in time that they had no involvement in. And to me, looking at this legislation, the government is more concerned about the banks than it is actually about tenants. And I think that's verified by even the measure that talks in the rental strategy about a fast-track approach to enable landlords to regain possession quickly where non-payment of rent constitutes grounds for termination. You know, the fact that so many buy-to-lets are in arrears of over 90 days or more, to the tune of 6 billion, and that a not insubstantial proportion, 11% actually, in arrears of 720 days, that's almost 2 years, show the banks are actually slow to initiate repossession even without mortgage payments being made. And I think some of these measures are actually about the bank's balance sheets more than concern for tenants and tenants' rights. And I think it's summed up very well. And the last point I'll make, Count Corley, is by Aidan Regan of the School of Politics in UCD, who to me summed it up very accurately. He says, if NAMA or the banks fire selling housing assets to solve the housing crisis, then all those underperforming loans and mortgages will be exposed. The debt dynamics of the banks will be exposed. The government will be exposed. Then the ECB is exposed. It's a house of cards, and the only thing holding everything together are rising rental and housing prices. Those renting and those who don't own mortgages are ultimately picking up the bill for the last crisis of which they had no part. Hence, the structural constraint underpinning the housing crisis is a convergence in the incentive structure to maintain sky-high rents and rising house prices. And that's in effect what the legislation before us has to do today. A solution and a different, more radical approach to actually deal with this was outlined incredibly effectively by Michael Byrne of NUIM in the Examiner earlier this year, where he put forward, instead of the type of measures that are going forward today, but a NAMA for buy-to-lets, a proper system put forward, basically an asset management agency that could step in, take the loans away from the banks, relieving the mortgage holders of the debt, rent the properties to the existing tenant at a deep discount. He calculates that will cost about 8.8 billion, which could be kept off balance sheet. A debt could be paid off over approximately 25 years of continuous affordable tenancy. An elegant, rational approach, manifestly in contrast to the measures that are here before us today.
Go on to